It looked like nothing more than a simple portrait, a mother seated beside her daughters, calm and composed. But something about it didn't sit right. If you focused on their hands, a quiet mystery began to unfold. Dr. James Mitchell had spent 15 years examining photographic archives at the New York Historical Society, uncovering countless stories hidden in old images. Yet even with all his experience, he had never encountered a detail quite like this. The photograph itself had surfaced unexpectedly, tucked inside a donation box collected from an estate sale in Brooklyn, a quiet arrival that hinted at a much deeper story waiting to be understood. Inside the box were dozens of fragile glass plate negatives, each one carefully wrapped in yellowed newspaper, dated 1923. Most of them revealed familiar scenes from the late 19th century stern-looking merchants, standing stiffly for the camera, elegant wedding parties frozen in time, children dressed neatly in their Sunday best. They were the kinds of images Dr. James Mitchell had seen countless times before. But then one photograph made him pause. 3 women gazed out from the past, their presence impossible to ignore. At the center sat a mother, perhaps around 40, composed and steady in an ornately carved wooden chair. On either side of her stood her daughters, likely in their late teens or early 20s. The 3 were African American, dressed with remarkable care in richly colored garments adorned with delicate lace. Their hair was styled with precision, reflecting both pride and intention. Behind them, a painted garden backdrop typical of studio portraits from that era added a soft, almost dreamlike setting. Yet it wasn't the careful composition or their calm, dignified expressions that held James's attention. It was their hands. The mother's hands rested gently in her lap, but their position felt anything but casual. Her fingers were interlaced in a pattern that seemed deliberate, her right thumb crossing over her left, while her index and middle fingers extended slightly, the others folded inward. The daughters each placed one hand on their mother's shoulders, and their fingers mirrored similarly precise arrangements. It wasn't random. It felt intentional, like a silent detail waiting patiently to be understood. Dr. James Mitchell had studied thousands of portraits from the Victorian era. In most of them, subjects held their hands in simple natural positions, resting gently in their laps or placed on nearby props. Photographers of that time required complete stillness because of long exposure times, meaning nothing in the frame was left to chance. Every pose, every gesture carried intention, and that was exactly what made this image so unusual. The positioning of their hands felt too precise, too deliberate to be accidental. He raised a magnifying glass and leaned in, examining the negative with renewed focus. There in the lower right corner, so faint it was almost invisible, someone had etched a small sequence of numbers directly into the glass, NY892247. The detail was subtle, but it felt significant. The image lingered in his thoughts long after he set it down. That evening, back in his apartment on the Upper West Side, he cleared his dining table and spread out his research materials, determined to take a closer look. Earlier, he had captured a high-resolution photograph of the glass negative. Now displayed on his laptop screen, the portrait appeared with striking clarity. For an image dating back to 1892, the level of detail was remarkable. The fine texture of the fabric stood out. The small brooch at the mother's collar caught the light, and even the subtle distinctions between the daughter's features became visible. What once seemed like a simple portrait was beginning to reveal something far more intricate, layer by layer. But it was the hands that refused to let go of his attention. Dr. James Mitchell zoomed in until each finger filled the screen. The arrangement was too exact to ignore. This wasn't casual. The mother's right thumb crossed deliberately over her left, a position that would have required focus to hold during a long exposure. Her extended fingers formed a shape that felt structured, almost coded. The daughter's hands resting on her shoulders echoed the same idea with subtle variations. Their fingers bent at careful angles, thumbs placed with clear intention. The repetition suggested design, not coincidence. James had spent years studying Civil War-era photography, Reconstruction documentation, and early 20th century social movements. He understood that in certain moments of history, people relied on visual cues, small, deliberate details embedded in everyday images. He had seen how posture objects and even spacing in photographs could carry meaning for those who knew how to recognize it. Turning to his research database, he began revisiting records of abolitionist efforts and post-emancipation networks. The Underground Railroad had famously relied on coded signals patterns in quilts lines, in songs, symbols hidden in plain sight. But this photograph was dated 1892, nearly 3 decades after the Emancipation Proclamation, and well after Reconstruction had come to an end, which raised a question he couldn't ignore if the need for such signals had changed. Why did this image still seem to carry one? What networks would still rely on hidden signals? The question lingered as his phone buzzed. It was his colleague, Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in African American history, replying to his earlier message, "Free tomorrow morning." "What did you find?" James paused for a moment before typing back. "Something that might reshape how we understand post-Reconstruction activism in New York. Bring anything you have on property rights and documentation issues." The next morning, Sarah arrived at the New York Historical Society right on time, a worn leather satchel slung over her shoulder filled with carefully gathered research. Inside the study room, Dr. James Mitchell had already projected the portrait onto the wall, enlarging it until the 3 women appeared almost lifelike. Their steady expressions seemed to meet the room in silence. "Look at their hands," James said, guiding her attention with a laser pointer. Every finger appeared placed with purpose. Sarah stepped closer, her focus sharpening as she studied the image. Setting her bag down, she pulled out a thick folder of notes. After Reconstruction ended in 1877, she began referencing the aftermath of Reconstruction-era African-American families in the North were navigating a very different kind of challenge. It wasn't slavery anymore, it was systematic exclusion. Legal barriers made property ownership complicated, inheritance claims uncertain, and even proving one's identity could become a serious obstacle. She glanced back at the photograph, then at James. In that environment, documentation wasn't just paperwork, it was power. And when official systems failed people, they sometimes found other ways to communicate, record, and protect what mattered. She began laying the materials out across the table: legal documents, city records, and carefully preserved newspaper clippings from the 1880s and 1890s. The picture they formed was far more complex than the popular image of New York as a uniformly progressive refuge. For many black families, stability was difficult to secure. Owning property, building businesses, or even confirming a legal marriage often required proof they simply didn't have. Many had arrived from the South, carrying little more than personal testimony. No birth certificates, no official marriage records, no formal documentation. James picked up a fragile newspaper dated 1891. The headline read, "Property Dispute in Harlem. Family claims ownership without documentation." He looked up. Sarah nodded, continuing her explanation. "I've been studying mutual aid societies from this period community networks that stepped in where institutions fell short." She pointed to several records in her folder. These groups pooled resources to hire legal help, shared knowledge about which officials might be fair, and developed their own ways of verifying identity and family ties when formal systems excluded them. "Hidden networks," James said quietly. Sarah shook her head slightly. "Not hidden in the way we usually think," she clarified. "More like parallel systems existing alongside official structures, using methods that weren't always recognized or understood by those in power." James turned back to the portrait, a new possibility forming in his mind. What if this wasn't simply a family photograph? What if it served another purpose, something closer to documentation? The faint numbers etched into the corner, NY 1892247, became the key. After 2 days of combing through city directories and business records, Dr. James Mitchell finally found a match. Studio 247 was registered to a photographer named Thomas Wright, who operated out of a building on 8th Avenue between 1888 and 1896. The address still stood. Though the original studio was long gone, the building itself had been converted into apartments decades earlier. James paused on the sidewalk, studying the aged brick facade and trying to picture it as it once was. Wright's studio would have occupied the second floor with large north-facing windows designed to capture the soft, even light that portrait photographers depended on. Digging deeper into Wright's background revealed something unexpected. He was white-born in Massachusetts in 1851 and had trained in Boston before relocating to New York in 1887 to establish his business. The neighborhood he chose was rapidly changing, home to Irish and Italian immigrants alongside a growing African-American community migrating from the South. It was a place where different lives intersected and where a simple photograph might carry far more meaning than it first revealed. But Wright's client list stood out in ways that were hard to ignore. At a time when many white photographers either turned away black clients or charged them unfairly, Thomas Wright took a different approach. His advertisements appeared in African-American newspapers, and his studio openly welcomed customers at equal rates. It was a quiet but meaningful choice in a divided era. Sarah uncovered an interview Wright had given to a small progressive paper in 1894. In it, he described photography not just as a business, but as a tool for dignity and record-keeping, something every person deserved, regardless of background. As Dr. James Mitchell read through the piece, he sensed something beneath the surface. Not overt statements, but a consistent pattern of intention and effort to serve those often overlooked. He was an ally, Dr. Sarah Chen said, quietly, glancing over his shoulder. James nodded, his thoughts returning to the photograph. And if those hand positions carry meaning, he said, then he may have helped preserve them, maybe even standardize them in some way. To explore the idea further, James reached out to Dr. Marcus Thompson, a specialist in visual communication systems at Columbia University. By that afternoon, Marcus arrived at the Historical Society, drawn in by James's brief but intriguing call. Whatever this image represented, it was beginning to connect disciplines, history, symbolism, and the possibility that even the smallest details could carry meaning across time. Codes from the Victorian era can seem incredibly complex to us now, Dr. Marcus Thompson explained as he studied the portrait, but for the people using them, they were usually practical. He leaned closer, examining the details. The key is context: who needed to communicate what they needed to share and who they needed to keep it from. He carefully photographed the hand positions from multiple angles, then opened his laptop and began building precise digital tracings. Let's assume each hand position represents something specific, but not letters, he continued. That would be too complicated for a photograph. More likely they indicate categories, confirmations, maybe even status. Nearby, Dr. Sarah Chen flipped through her research notes on documentation challenges. What if it's tied to identity verification, she suggested. These communities needed reliable ways to confirm who someone was, that they belonged, that they could be trusted, especially when official systems failed them. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. The mother's hand position could represent her role, perhaps a family head, or someone recognized within a network who could vouch for others. The daughter's positions might reflect their own standing, documented, undocumented, or in the process of seeking support. Across the table, Dr. James Mitchell compared the portrait with other photographs recovered from the same estate box. As the afternoon stretched on, they searched for patterns, small consistencies that might connect one image to another. What had started as a single curious detail was beginning to take shape as something larger, hinting at a system built not on secrecy alone, but on trust adaptation and shared understanding. 3 additional portraits revealed the same carefully arranged hand positions, never obvious, always intentional. In one image, a couple's fingers intertwined in a way that formed a quiet, almost mathematical pattern. In another, a man placed his hand on a Bible, certain fingers extended with precision. This isn't a single code, Marcus said at last, his voice steady with realization. It's a structured system, layers of signals that can be combined to communicate different meanings. Someone had clearly taught these families how to pose. Someone had taken these photographs with purpose. And beyond them, there were others, individuals within a wider network who understood how to interpret what was being shown. Then Sarah uncovered the insight that shifted everything. While examining property rights cases in New York courts from the 1890s, she noticed a striking pattern. Numerous African-American families had successfully defended ownership claims, secured identity records, or validated legal marriages, often represented by the same attorney. His name surfaced repeatedly. Robert Hayes. He operated an office on West 34th Street. Court documents revealed that he won an unusually high number of cases for black clients during a time when such outcomes were uncommon. Even more notable was his consistent use of photographic evidence family portraits that demonstrated stability, identity, and connection to the community, presented as compelling support within the legal system. James felt the realization settle in as the pieces aligned. Hayes wasn't using Wright's photographs merely to confirm identity. He was presenting them as proof of belonging, of recognized place within a community. These families sat for portraits that were carefully preserved, systematically organized, and ready when needed. In court, Hayes could draw on those images, offering them to judges as quiet but persuasive documentation. But the story reached further than that. While reviewing Hayes's archived case files at the New York Public Library, Sarah uncovered a collection of letters exchanges between Hayes and a network of activists, educators, ministers, and business leaders. Their words outlined something far more deliberate: shared methods for verification and community-based record-keeping. One letter dated March 1893 stood out. Writing to a minister in Brooklyn, Hayes noted, "We have expanded our photographic documentation to include 73 families." He went on to explain that Mr. Wright continued offering his services at minimal cost, ensuring access for those who needed it most. The hand positioning system Hayes described allowed essential details to be embedded in each image information that could later be confirmed when required. Every portrait served a dual purpose: a dignified representation of a family's life and a practical form of identification within a system they could rely on. James leaned back, absorbing the full scope of it. They hadn't just adapted, they had built an entire parallel documentation system. When official institutions failed to recognize them, these communities created their own structure of proof and trust. And as Sarah quietly added, they did it in a way that was visible to all, yet understood by only those who knew how to see it. At first glance, the portraits appeared entirely ordinary, simple family photographs, the kind anyone might overlook. To a casual observer, there was nothing unusual to notice, but for those within the network trained to recognize the subtle system, each image carried essential meaning quietly embedded in plain view. As this hidden structure came into focus, James found himself fixated on a new question: the identities of the three women in the original portrait. The trail led back to an estate sale from a brownstone in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, a neighborhood with a long and deeply rooted African-American history. Records from the Historical Society identified the seller as Patricia Johnson, who had inherited the home from her grandmother. That same evening, James reached out. Patricia, 72, spoke with a sharp, cautious tone, unsure why anyone would be interested in old family photographs. But as James carefully described the portrait, something shifted. Her voice softened, edged with recognition. "My great-great-grandmother," she said quietly. "That's Ellaner Morrison. The girls beside her would be my grandmother Ruth and her sister Grace." James paused, then asked gently, "Can you tell me about them?" There was a brief silence on the line before Patricia continued. "Ellaner was born enslaved in Virginia. She came north after the war, carrying Ruth in her arms, a baby who wouldn't remember the journey but would live its consequences. Later, Grace was born in New York, in a city that promised opportunity but demanded resilience. Ellaner found her place behind a needle and thread, working as a seamstress. People spoke of her with quiet admiration, praising the delicacy of her lace and the precision of her embroidery. It wasn't just a craft. It was how she held her family together, stitch by careful stitch. When asked if she had ever joined any groups or organizations, Patricia paused before answering. She was active in her church, she said softly, and she helped people. That was the same story passed down through generations. Ellaner was the one families turned to when they needed guidance, someone who could untangle paperwork, locate housing, or connect them with the right lawyer. She had an uncanny understanding of systems that often felt impossible to navigate, as if she carried an internal map no one else could see. James felt a sudden spark of realization. "Patricia," he said, his voice gaining urgency, "I think your great-grandmother was part of something much bigger, a network dedicated to helping African-American families secure their identities and safeguard their rights after Reconstruction." Patricia fell silent, the weight of the idea settling in. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with emotion. "I always knew she was extraordinary," she admitted, "but so much of our history was lost." She let out a quiet breath. After she passed in 1919, the family drifted apart. My grandmother hardly ever spoke about those early years. With Patricia's blessing, James and Sarah began to follow the threads of Ellaner Morrison's life, determined to piece together the hidden story she had left behind. Church records from Bethel Church in Brooklyn placed Ellaner as an active member from 1879 until the end of her life. She served on the Ladies' Aid Society, a group officially devoted to helping families in need. On the surface, the records reflected routine acts of charity, names, ages, circumstances, and basic needs carefully written down. But as the pages unfolded, a subtle pattern began to emerge. Some entries included odd notations, numbers, and letter codes that didn't seem to belong. At first glance, they looked random. Then Sarah noticed something remarkable. The markings aligned with Thomas Wright's numbering system, revealing a hidden layer beneath the ordinary records. They were cross-referencing. Sarah explained, her voice steady but filled with discovery. The Church Society quietly identified families who needed proper documentation. Thomas Wright captured their images using a specific hand-positioning method, while Hayes ensured those photographs could support legal recognition. Meanwhile, the church records tracked every step carefully concealed within what appeared to be standard charity work. What looked like simple assistance was, in reality, an organized effort to help families establish and protect their identities. As James dug deeper, he uncovered more photographs within Thomas Wright's archive. The local historical society had obtained the full collection in 1923 after his passing, but it had never been fully cataloged. Dozens of portraits revealed the same deliberate hand positions, each image numbered with precision. Taken between 1890 and 1896, the photographs told a powerful story, one of families who had been overlooked by official systems, now carefully documented through a method that preserved their presence and affirmed their place in history. As their investigation deepened, more names began to surface, each one a quiet thread in a much larger tapestry. There was Samuel Brooks, a dedicated teacher who helped families secure school records for their children, ensuring their education could be recognized. Mary Chen worked in the city property office, carefully processing deeds and making sure critical paperwork was properly filed. And then there was Reverend James Washington, who performed marriages and issued certificates when official channels turned people away, offering legitimacy where it was often denied. Each of them worked quietly, using their roles to support others in ways that were both practical and meaningful. They navigated systems that were not always designed to serve the communities they cared about, finding lawful and resourceful ways to make a difference. Together, they formed something remarkable, a kind of informal archive that preserved identity, dignity, and continuity when official records fell short. It was not hidden in secrecy, but woven into everyday acts of service, where compassion and persistence became tools for change. 3 months into their research, James and Sarah brought these stories into the light with an exhibition at the Historical Society. They selected 20 portraits from Thomas Wright's collection, each one featuring the distinctive hand positioning system. Alongside every photograph was the story they had carefully reconstructed, lives once overlooked, now given voice and recognition. Patricia Johnson attended the event, standing before her great-grandmother's portrait as it was honored publicly for the first time. She wasn't alone. Her daughter and granddaughter stood beside her 3 generations, witnessing a history that at last had been brought back into view. 4 generations of Ellaner Morrison's family stood side by side, facing the image that had quietly set everything in motion. What began as a single discovery had grown into something far greater, a shared legacy finally visible. Yet the most powerful moment of the exhibition came when other descendants began to arrive. James and Sarah had managed to trace families connected to 12 of the individuals in the photographs. Each person brought something with them, fragments of memory preserved in stories, letters, and worn documents that now fit together with unexpected clarity, revealing a larger, interconnected history. An elderly man, Thomas Hayes, paused before a portrait of his great-grandfather, Robert Hayes. In the image, the elder Hayes stood with his hands arranged in the same deliberate pattern. "I always heard he helped people," Thomas said quietly. "But I never understood how much, or that he was part of something this organized." Nearby, Grace Brooks studied the portrait of Samuel Brooks, her expression shifting as past and present began to align. "My family used to say he was arrested in 1895 for helping a family obtain false documents," she said, her voice thoughtful. "But the charges were dropped. And now, seeing this, I don't think those documents were false at all. I think he was helping people secure what they were rightfully owed, but had been denied." Her words seemed to echo the deeper truth emerging from the exhibition, that these efforts were not about deception, but about restoring recognition and fairness within an imperfect system. As the stories unfolded, the significance of the discovery reached beyond the room. Even the New York Times took notice, bringing wider attention to a history that had remained hidden for far too long. The article appeared under the striking headline, "Hidden in Plain Sight: How Post-Reconstruction Activists Built a Secret Documentation Network." It didn't take long for its impact to ripple outward. Within days, historians from across the country reached out to James, each bringing forward discoveries from their own regions. Similar networks began to take shape in the historical record efforts in Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago. Though separated by distance, they shared a common purpose, using coded systems and photography to help African American families document their identities and safeguard their rights while navigating challenging institutions of the time. Six months after the first portrait was uncovered, James stood in the quiet stillness of the Historical Society's conservation lab, carefully holding the fragile glass plate negative. Piece by piece, he and Sarah had digitally restored dozens of images from Thomas Wright's collection. What had once been nearly forgotten was now preserved, each photograph accessible to descendants, scholars, and future generations. The portrait of the mother and her daughters had taken on a life of its own, appearing in textbooks, featured in documentaries, and displayed in museums as a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. Yet for James, its meaning remained deeply personal. He often thought of Ellaner Morrison, a woman born into slavery who went on to build a life defined by dignity and purpose in New York. Through her quiet determination, she helped families find their way through systems that often failed to recognize them. And in that single photograph, standing beside her daughters with their hands arranged in a thoughtful, deliberate code, she ensured that their presence and their story would endure, carried forward into history where it belonged. Patricia Johnson chose to donate Ellaner's personal papers to the Historical Society Letters diary entries and careful records from her years as a seamstress. Within those pages, a voice long unheard began to speak again. One diary entry stood out: "Had our portrait made today. Mr. Wright is a kind man, understands what we are building. The girls were nervous, but I told them this picture will matter." It was a simple note, yet filled with quiet certainty, an awareness that their actions carried meaning beyond the present moment. And she had been right. The photograph mattered in ways no one at the time could fully measure. It preserved more than faces. It carried proof of determination, creativity, and a steadfast refusal to be forgotten. As Sarah continued her research, she was able to trace 63 families connected through the network. Each story revealed how people secured property deeds, legal marriages, business licenses, and school records, fundamental rights that should have been easily granted, yet often required persistence, cooperation, and ingenuity to obtain. The network itself appeared to have operated between 1888 and 1897, supporting hundreds of families before gradually fading. As circumstances changed, some members passed on, others relocated, and new systems slowly took shape. Thomas Wright died in 1923, his contributions largely overlooked for decades. Robert Hayes continued his legal work until 1910, while Ellaner Morrison lived long enough to see her daughters build stable lives of their own. Though the original network eventually dissolved, its purpose endured, carried forward through the lives it helped shape and the generations that followed. The network hadn't erased injustice, but it offered something just as vital in its time-practical support for those who needed it most. James now met regularly with descendants, listening to their stories, gathering oral histories, and reconnecting families who shared this once-hidden legacy. What began as a single photograph had grown into something far more meaningful. It was no longer just evidence of the past, it had become a bridge between generations, a reminder that their ancestors were resourceful, connected, and determined to pursue fairness even when systems failed to provide it. He often found himself thinking about Ellaner Morrison's hands carefully positioned in that Brooklyn studio in 1892. A small, deliberate gesture, yet one that carried meaning far beyond its moment. Through that quiet code, her story endured, traveling across more than a century to be understood at last. In the end, it was a powerful reminder even the simplest actions can hold lasting significance. Sometimes all it takes is a closer look to truly see.